This is the business of Africa. If it's about Africa, then it's our business, bringing big and small business issues right to your doorstep. Industrialization is said to be one of the most redefining phenomena in history, altering how we ultimately live and work. It has been attributed to driving economic growth, with suggestions that countries can move from low to middle income status by adopting a strategic industrial development plan. Investments in manufacturing and industry are said to yield economic returns in the form of employment, skills development, and infrastructure development, among others. We hone in on South Africa in this episode of The Business of Africa, looking specifically at the contribution of the country's retail sector in contributing towards localization. Now, according to the National Statistical Service of South Africa, retail trade sales rose by 3.5% in the last quarter of 2025, representing 21 consecutive months of positive year-on-year growth. The country's clothing, textile, footwear and leather sector is a crucial lever for industrialization. Ishad Kathrada is the CEO of the Localization Support Fund. He joins us now to take a look at this and more. Thank you very much, Ishad, for your time on this episode of The Business of Africa. Let's take a look firstly at the Localization Support Fund. Please introduce it to our listeners.
Thanks so much, Duduzile, and thanks for having me on the show. So the Localization Support Fund was set up about 5 or 6 years ago as a partnership between government and the private sector. So it was a concept that came out of the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, that we needed a institution that would be focused on localization and really trying to solve the very particular and detailed problems that we have in terms of scaling up manufacturing in South Africa. There's a lot of political will and there's a lot of political intent to foster manufacturing, but the reality on the ground is that there are often very particular problems. So we are funded by the private sector. We don't sit inside of government. And our real main aim is to mobilize expertise in support of manufacturing. That's everywhere from research to try and identify where the challenges, where the problems, but where also the opportunities are. And then into the next step of capacity building and facilitating, effectively bringing people together across the value chain so that we can actually realize the industrial outcomes that we so desperately need in South Africa.
Absolutely. Speaking of your work in terms of research, you conducted a feasibility of garment localization in the country. Let's start with how the research was conducted.
So the primary objective of the study was very much connected to what has been referred to as the retail clothing, textile, footwear, leather master plan. Mm-hmm. It's a bit of a mouthful, but effectively what that was a coming together of stakeholders from government to clothing retailers, manufacturers, and organized labor to try and identify ways and means of increasing local sourcing as a way to then drive demand and job creation, etc. And there was a very ambitious target that was set back in 2019 when the master plan was signed of increasing local sourcing from then around 35 to 40% as it was to about 65% over the period of about 10 years. Now, initially, it was actually reasonably successful. In the year that the master plan was signed, local retailers were purchasing around 250 million garments per annum from local manufacturers, and that increased over a short period of time to around about 390 million. So from 250 to 390. But then there was a little bit of a lull. And so one of the things that we wanted to do as part of our study was to identify where do we take this next phase in the industrialization in the sector. And so we really needed to understand what is it that retailers are looking to localize? What are the price points? What are the main concerns that they have in terms of fashion, quality, sustainability? We then needed to understand where the local manufacturing capability and capacity was and whether it lined up well with what retailers needed. And then the final step in the study was to try and see, to the extent that there was a gap in the various product categories that we had identified, how we could begin to bridge that gap. How could we build a real commercial business case for increased localization? So the first step, as I say, was a survey of retailers. And we spoke to some of the largest retailers in the country, the likes of your TFG, the Foschini Group, Mr. Price, Woolworths, Pick n Pay, etc. And asked them, if you localize, what would it be? What specific product categories? And what was fascinating about that piece of the study is, what it is that retailers are localizing, or wanting to localize. So the first thing that came out was denims, jeans and that kind of things. And it's a real interesting reason why that is. I mean, since the COVID pandemic, one, we're all working from home a little bit more, and so jeans is obviously, much more acceptable in that sense. But also we're dressing down a little bit more when we come into the office. And so there's a greater demand for denims in South Africa. And so retailers are really looking to try and see how they can localize that. The second area was something referred to as athleisure. That's the kind of clothing you wear when you go to gym or when you go to yoga. And, you see it a lot on the streets of, if you live in the Atlantic seaboard of Cape Town, you see a lot of people just wearing it on the streets. That was another area where retailers were looking to try and localize. And then the final big area is still what's referred to as basic knits. That's your t-shirts and sweaters, the kind of things that people are wearing every day. And what retailers said to us is that actually there were about 81 million garments that they would want to try and localize in South Africa by the end of this decade, so over the next 5 years. And that, if we could get that right, would be a 20% increase to local sourcing. It would bring 8 billion rands worth of manufacturing output back to South Africa and create about 34,000 jobs, which would be really material, obviously, for a sector which over the last 25 years has, sadly, for different reasons, and we can unpack that a little bit, shed a number of jobs. So I think, we've got, in a sense, kind of our clear marching orders of where do we need to focus our attention. I think that's quite important because, what we realize about any industrial strategy or any attempt at industrialization is you can't scattergun about this. You've got to have a focused approach. And I think knowing now that we need to have a strategy on denims, knowing that we now need to have a strategy on basic knits, which we think we can achieve in the short to medium term, is really important. Athleisure might take us a little bit longer because we lack some of the upstream capability in terms of fabrics, what they often call technical fabrics. It's not to say that we can't do it, but it might take us just a little bit longer.
I'd like for us to focus on the appetite for the 81 million additional locally produced garments per year by 2030. This is said to add nearly 8 billion rand in annual manufacturing output and create up to 34,000 new jobs in the country. And the proverbial devil is in the detail. How can this be achieved? How do we bridge the gap?
Yeah, absolutely. So on denims, and I think that's a big part of the 81 million garments, there are about 7 to 8 million additional garments right there. So call it about 10% is clustered in denims, which is a very high value segment for South Africa. We've built up some nascent capacity. So there's a number of manufacturers, actually all largely based in KZN, in places like Esitebe and Hammersdale, that are beginning to produce denims. Now, one of the challenges, obviously, looking at the supply chain, because we don't have a lot of the fabric making capability in South Africa, but some of that fabric making capability has been built up in places like Lesotho, so right across the border. And so one of the things we're looking at is how do we support and help Lesotho to continue to grow in that, produce the fabrics that we will ultimately need, and then ensure that our manufacturers can produce at the right quality, the right fashion, and also sustainably, because denims has a significant kind of environmental footprint. It uses quite a lot of water, because to get the right color and finish and feeling in a pair of jeans, there's quite a lot of washing that needs to happen. So it goes through these sort of washing processes, and there's been quite a lot of investment by some of the manufacturers in, water recycling, etc. Anyway, the point is to say that we are building up that, and so we're working now with a group of denim manufacturers and the retailers, and beginning to understand a little bit more what is it that the retailers would need. So I've been sitting with some of your major retailers, the likes of your Woolworths, your TFG, and beginning to get a better sense of what is it that they would want, where do they see consumer needs going, and how do we ensure that there is the manufacturing capability. Sometimes there's a skills gap, and that's something we'll need to have a look at. And how do we bring in the right technical capability that can then share some of those learnings with local artisans and manufacturers. But I think one of the important things that's coming out of this is that scale is incredibly important. This is not an industry that would lend itself to a lot of kind of small and medium-sized companies to operate at the level and to be competitive with, East Asia, but also other African countries. I mean, a lot of denim production has moved to places like Mauritius and Madagascar. And to operate at to be able to compete with imports coming through, there's a considerable level of scale that we need, which is significant investment. But I think it's lining up between retailers. And I think, the big thing that came out of our study is the willingness to localize from retailers. They want to, not just as goodwill to the South African economy, but actually because it makes better business sense. Because what they've all realized is that to compete with the likes of Shein and Temu and some of the other international offerings that are available in South Africa, there's a greater level of agility that's required. It means that if for whatever reason a style that you put on the shelves isn't selling, you need to get that off the shelf as quickly as possible and get something new onto the shelf as quickly as possible to support. And that lends itself to having your local manufacturing much closer to home so that you can run lead times of a matter of weeks as opposed to months, which is sort of the traditional retail model that we've had before.
If we want to scale the production more so of denim, where are we currently sourcing our denim? You speak of the likes of Lesotho, collaboration there with Lesotho, which would boost intra-Africa trade, I am assuming. But currently, where is it that we're sourcing most of our denim?
So it comes from all over the place. I mean, traditionally, the Italians had built up real capacity in denims. And so a lot of your sort of higher end denims will come from Europe, but also parts of Asia as well. But increasingly, a lot is coming from, as I say, parts of Africa. So Mauritius has invested massively in huge manufacturing capacity, not just in denims, but other areas as well, basic knits. And so they've been quite successful there. Madagascar as well. Now, we obviously, as you say, intra-African trade is an incredibly important part of realizing the dreams of the African continental free trade area, etc. But we want to do it in such a way where there's benefit that can be shared across the value chain, where perhaps some of your early stage fabric making can be done in other African countries, and then hopefully the last mile manufacturing can be done in South Africa. So that's an area where we are trying to focus on. I think some of that partnership, as I say, with Lesotho is an area that we're looking to try and expand upon over the near term.
The report confirms that South Africa's manufacturing base has real depth and technical capability, with around half of the localization opportunity already in place. How can this opportunity be unlocked at scale? More so when you take a look at some of the reforms that are underway in South Africa. You speak of denim mostly being heavily reliant on water. To industrialize, you also need a stable electricity grid, etc. And so how can this opportunity be unlocked at scale? What is it that you are telling your stakeholders in government that you need to make this a reality?
Look, there's definitely a role for government at the table as much as there is for industry. I think there's a couple of areas where the report has been quite helpful in sort of understanding the role of government. As I said initially, when we put the master plan together, we were reasonably successful in fostering localization. Part of that was because there was a rebate mechanism which was put in place on woven fabrics. And woven fabrics are indeed the kind of fabrics that would go into denims or into dresses and that kind of thing. Now, previously what was in place was a fairly heavy duty on imports, where there wasn't any real capacity and capability in the country. And so a rebate mechanism was put in place to ensure that if there wasn't capacity, that retailers could apply for a rebate and pass those cost savings onto their manufacturers, and in that way kind of foster a much more dynamic and growing kind of manufacturing base. We're now looking at whether or not we should be extending this to other fabric types, basic knits and yarns, and the type of fabric that might go into other garments. Part of the strategy has been to try and build demand in that depth of manufacturing, which is what is often referred to as cut, make, and trim, CMT. If we can grow that, over time we can help to build the demand case and the business case for some of the textile capabilities in the country. We had a lot of it in the past, but sadly, just because of low capacity utilization and high fixed costs, it made it quite challenging. I think you also mentioned some of the challenges with electricity, and I think this is something which is not just a problem in the clothing industry. I think we have seen energy costs pick up in the across the board. Energy costs have increased far faster than inflation has over the last 10 to 15 years, and that has hurt a number of manufacturing industries. We are starting to see that slowly that problem is starting to resolve itself, particularly for those that have the opportunity to bring in renewable energy, solar, etc. It's a lot more cost effective. It can't be done in all places, but I think that's an area where we do want to see sort of some, increased investment, and obviously the work which will be done in terms of expanding the transmission and distribution grid will also hopefully help to bring down costs there. But I think the other area where we're hoping to see some further government intervention is in the area of what's referred to as under-invoicing. And this is where garments are being imported into South Africa, but the prices that are being put on the crates and containers are far lower than the actual market value of those goods. So to give just some round numbers to it, or just a sense of it, a man's suit that may cost, say, 1,000 rand being exported out of wherever it might be, East Asia, China, whatever the case is, will be brought into South Africa, and the price of 100 rand will be put on the garment. So it distorts the prices, but it also ensures that the full customs duties that should be received by SARS aren't. So SARS has been doing quite a bit of work, supported by the Department of Trade and Industry, as well as ITAC, the International Trade Administration Commission, to put some more boots on the ground and be a little bit more agile and adept at identifying where this happens. But we really need to see much more of that, because under-invoicing is a big challenge in the market that distorts prices and unfortunately just takes jobs away from South Africans.
And that is the point. It oftentimes also kills industry. So the intervention there is quite critical. I'd like for us to take a look at what you mentioned a little bit earlier on in terms of a skills gap. What does the skills shortage mean, and which roles that are most critical to productivity do we see skills gap?
Yeah, so, depending on the product category, what we see is that there are different skills needed. So, I'll talk a little bit more about denims because this has been having a lot more of the conversation recently, is that, first of all, the machinery that's being brought in is very sophisticated, expensive machinery that requires some, considerable engineering talent inside of a mill. Now, previously, this was not something that the clothing industry really invested in, but we're seeing that we absolutely have to have that. And so it's real technical engineers that know how to run the machinery, that can get the best out of it, and know that, how to use it as efficiently as possible. But then, of course, there's just sort of working with the fabrics. Well, one thing we've learned with sort of denims as well is that, through the washing process, the garment may shrink or expand or stretch in different ways, and one therefore needs to know how to cut and pattern make appropriately. So there are different sets of skills along the way, from pattern making to cutting and trimming to seaming, all of which require specific skills. Now, it's not to say that we don't have the ability to upskill people, but it takes time. And I think it's that investment that we need to see. And I think it's one thing that we're trying to do as the Localization Support Fund, wearing our hat as a public benefit organization, but also as a non-profit, is to see how we can support some of these skilling initiatives that are going on across the country. Do we need to bring in expertise from abroad and bring them into country for a period of time so that they can teach people locally who can then transmit and pass on the skills to greater numbers of people? So I think there's a range of different skills. I mean, we're very good in some of the seaming work, so we've got, teams of seamstresses working at various factories across the country. I think there's a lot of capability that we've developed over time that we can expand upon. But it's some of the more technical things that we need. And then probably the final area is just management capability in factories. And I think that's something that we're seeing needs to move and evolve with the time, especially because there are new tools that are being introduced to help managers better understand their business. Visualization, machine learning can now do a much better job at understanding where the gaps in the manufacturing process are, where the inefficiencies are, and having managers that can respond quickly to that, but then also to transfer those learnings to their workforce in a way that everyone can pick up on. I think that's the key areas where we see skills being needed.
You touched on compliance, more so on players who come into the country and therefore find their wares either online, available to the South African market, or in retailers. Now, when we speak of maybe social compliance, and I'll say social compliance in this context, Dudu, Ezekiel, and Edward, when they go to the shop, the most important thing for them is pricing, right? So if I find a locally manufactured garment or a pair of jeans and it's priced at 500 Rand, and I go online to these fast fashion retailers, and like you said, the mispricing, it's 100 Rand. The natural choice is to go for the 100 Rand. What do we say to South Africans about localization, and not just it being about creating jobs? Because most of them will be like, well, I'm not even in line for those jobs. The unemployment figures were released recently, and millions of people have even given up on looking for work in South Africa. And so what is the case for localization in the country? What do you say to a South African in terms of supporting locally made garments?
It's a very difficult balance to get right. And, I have a lot of sympathy and empathy for South Africans at the moment. I mean, we are going through a cost of living crisis, and, balance sheets are constrained and pockets are tight, and absolutely understand. I think there's a couple of things that I will say is that often when one goes online and looks at these offshore e-commerce players, the likes of Temu, etc., the price that you see online is not the full price. And, this is something we had done some work last year in August that we also published, looking at the economic impact, but also some of the recommendations and, what other countries were doing to support their local industries, also dealing with offshore e-commerce. And we found that, the full taxes, for example, that's your VAT and your customs duty, they aren't often included in the price that a South African will see. So you may think that you're going to be paying 100 Rand, for example, but actually later on down the line, that's only what you're paying the retailer. There's about another sort of 25 to 30% of taxes. Now that's actually illegal under South African law. And so we've brought it to the attention of the National Consumer Commission, which is the body responsible for consumer rights in South Africa. And they've actually launched an investigation into the retail practices of some of these players. And I think it's misleading to the South African consumer, because I absolutely understand that South African consumers are looking to get the best deal that they possibly can. But if the pricing that they are being told they will pay is actually misleading, that's a massive problem. I think the second thing is that, we do think that South African manufacturers are able to compete on price. And we see this. The challenge is, it's always a question of at the right scale. And this is why part of our study was trying to build a business case for how, particularly on basic knits, so that's your T-shirts, which is the sort of everyday item that South Africans are wearing, how do we bring ourselves in line, recognizing that at the end of the day, the consumer will gravitate towards the cheapest price, and retailers therefore need to ensure that they have an offering for a full range of pockets. And I think that there are models that we can begin to introduce in South Africa. So one such model is this the idea of industrial parks. And in the Western Cape, we are now starting to work with a range of stakeholders in how we could pilot an industrial park in the clothing sector that has huge scale, the kind of scale where over time you're able to bring down your unit costs effectively and provide the right kind of offering to retailers in the country. We've been engaging with retailers around whether or not they'd be interested in partnering with this. We're getting a lot of real, positive interest from retailers. Obviously, like you say, the devil's in the detail, and that's the parts that we're working through at the moment. I think we can't get away from the fact that cost is an important element of it, but there are other parts as well. And I think retailers have said to us that while cost is important, making sure that they have a local and dynamic and vibrant supply of clothing is also important to them. And that's something that they're looking to try and foster as well.
Fair enough. I'd like for us to just look at, in conclusion, a recommendation on the report. And that recommendation, there's a couple of recommendations, but there's one that really stood out for me. The establishment or establishing of export capability as a structural pillar of localization. And in that, establishing a South African apparel export platform. I believe it's Proudly South African that has a platform where anyone from the world can literally just go on and see Proudly South African goods on that platform. So maybe you can help us place this recommendation of a South African apparel export platform in relation to what they're doing? Are they two separate things? Please help us understand that.
So I think if I just take just a step back and around this, is recognize that we wanted to always use the local market as the anchored demand that can get the flywheels moving, if you will, that can get factories working, but that we can't possibly just rely on local demand, in part because there's a lot of seasonality in clothes. And we'll be wearing t-shirts today, but then jackets tomorrow, or jerseys and jumpers, and that may not be the same kind of a factory. So we have to look to export markets as well. We've had some South African retailers that have been somewhat successful in going abroad, but what we recognize that we need a countrywide capability that can sing the praises of and sell South African quality goods to the rest of the world. Proudly SA are doing an excellent job, but I think for us, that's the first step. And I think what we need to do is have a range of different parties working in concert with each other. So one of the things that we want to try and champion, working very closely with the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition and other bodies, is how can we resource a capability that when there are outward missions to Europe or Asia or wherever the case might be, that as part of that outward mission, there's an understanding of what our capability is in South Africa, that we know what we can produce, and we can very easily begin plugging into the different value chains. So the work still needs to be done on this. There's very much the concept idea of something, but it needs to be industry-wide, because an individual retailer, an individual manufacturer may be able to do it, but it's a lot of hard work in terms of pushing it. If we can do it at an industry-wide level, we should be able to see kind of greater scale in our export capability. And if we can compete locally in our local market, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to compete in export markets as well, especially in areas where we've got a unique style, a unique sense of fashion, unique way of dealing with fabrics. I think increasingly there's a recognition that South African apparel has a place in the global offering because
Absolutely.
of its style. Yeah.
Absolutely. Ishad, thank you so much for your time on this episode of The Business of Africa. Ishad Kathrada is the CEO of the Localization Support Fund. Thank you very much for tuning into the Business of Africa podcast, where we bring big and small business issues right to your doorstep. You'll hear from us again in the next fortnight, God willing. Bahaichu, Bula.